All right. Hi, everybody. It is nice to see so many of you back. 5 webinars is a commitment, so the fact that you've made it through 4 is impressive. As always, it's important to thank the NHPRC for providing the funding for this series of webinars. So thank you to them. And title slide. And here we are at week 4, where we are going to talk about procedures and supplies and implementation. So by the end of today, my plan is that you will be able to write the emergency procedures your institution needs, create your supply list and describe supply storage strategies, and assemble your plan and implement it. Hopefully, you have already done most of the heavy lifting on this, and we are shifting into the phase that's mostly clerical. So today, we are going to, as always, start out with a brief recap of what we did last week. We'll talk about procedures. We'll talk about now that how you have finished all of your research and gathered all of your data, how you actually put the plan together. We'll talk about emergency supplies because going shopping is the most fun part of emergency planning. And we will finish up by talking about implementing your plan, because a plan is great to have, but if your staff don't know about it and don't know how to use it, you have put a lot of effort in for something that isn't going to get used. So you want everyone to understand what the plan is about. So what did we do last week? Last week was the week where we talked about preliminary research. Was that last week, or did I skip a slide? I almost feel like I missed putting a slide in there. So last week, research, templates, spent a lot of time on risk assessment, and hopefully you have gone out and done some risk assessment with your staff. So are there any lingering questions from last week? If there are, this would be a good time to put them in the box. Yeah, last week was contacts, wasn't it? So I'm sorry, I had the wrong slide in there. Last week we talked all about your contacts and mapping your facility. So are there any questions about who you should have in your plan, how you're going to find those people, how you're going to do a map of your facility? I'm not seeing any come in. So why don't we go ahead and get started with this week? And the first thing we want to talk about this week is procedures. It's great to have all of this information you've amassed, all of the contacts, all of the information about your building, everything mapped out, but you need procedures so that your staff know what to do with that information. And my rule of thumb, especially on the first round of creating a disaster plan, is that I like to recommend people create procedures for anything that they've identified as a high or moderate possibility of happening during their risk assessment. So if you are rating things on a scale of 1 to 5, like we did in the polls a couple of weeks ago, anything that's a 3, 4, or 5, I would want to make a plan for. If you are using the REP location assessment form, theirs is more complicated, and they have that sort of formula where they multiply the amount of damage possible times the likelihood of that damage happening, and you get anywhere from 0 to 25. Anything that's in from 15 up, maybe 12 up, are what I would put in my plan the first time out. It's better to start. No, let me rephrase that. You can always add more if you decide that you need it, but if you start and are too ambitious and want to do something for everything, you're likely to get bogged down, which we don't want. So, common types of procedures that you'll see, you will see evacuation plans, and hopefully you already have evacuation plans and have them posted, because that's a legal thing. But evacuation plans are definitely a type of a procedure. You also usually have procedures for human emergencies. That's going to be what happens if somebody on your staff or somebody who is visiting your archives comes in and has a medical issue. They have a heart attack. Who do you call? Or what if there's an active shooter? And your police department may be able to come in and do actual active shooter training for you if that's something you're interested in. You also want to have procedures for theft. Generally, the procedure for theft is that you do not confront the person that you think is stealing things, but that you record information and call the police. You're also including procedures for collections emergencies, floods and fire and earthquakes if you're somewhere that might get an earthquake, tornado if you're somewhere that might get a tornado. Again, that's going back to the location risk assessments that you have hopefully already done. And then it's a good idea to think about where you're going to put your procedures. First, obviously, you're going to put them in your plan. And it'll be a section of your plan. But also, not everybody needs a copy of your plan, but everybody should have copies of the procedures, or at least certain of the procedures. There may be ones that are high security that you don't want every volunteer without a security clearance who works in your institution having access to. But for the most part, you want everyone to have access to procedures. So good places to put them include the reception desk. There's almost always someone at the reception desk. Also keep copies inside your collection storage areas, administrative offices, break rooms, anywhere that people tend to congregate. And you may also ask people to keep copies of them in their offices. And you can think about what format makes sense for you. There are all kinds of options. You could do a flip chart. Flip charts are very, very fun because they are tactile, and you can do them on different colors of Xerox paper, so they're colorful and cheerful. And people tend to like those, but also they can be a lot of work to assemble. If you can do something and distill everything down to a very few bullet points, you can put a one-page piece together that you can laminate or put in a frame and hang everywhere and give people a copy to put by their phones. You could have them in a binder somewhere. That would be for a really thorough copy. I worked with a museum client once who had lots and lots of docents leading tours. And what they planned to do was get the most important ones for the docents on a card that they could fit on their lanyard. So they were wearing them all the time when they were giving tours. So they were always at the ready. So you can think about all the procedures that you need and write them. I'm surprised that I don't have a slide for it, but it is on your resource list. The California Preservation Program has written a really good set of generic procedures, right? Because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. No need to do that. Other people have written procedures. So you can use the California Preservation Program procedures as a jumping off spot and just tweak them to fit your circumstances. So you have written your procedures and you have finally done really all of the heavy lifting, and you can proceed to writing your plan, which hopefully will go together pretty darn quickly because you have done all of the groundwork appropriately early on. So first things first, just some general logistical points. Use your template that you already chose. That's why you have it. And hopefully you've chosen the template that is appropriate for your size and your resources. Remember to share the work. You are here sitting and listening to this webinar, which means you may know more than everybody on your team, but that means you are directing and managing, not doing all of the writing, hopefully. It's much better to share that out so different people have ownership and input, and so more people know what's in the plan. So share the responsibility, share the joy. And again, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that y'all are busy and have more on your plate than you can deal with on a regular basis anyhow. And this is the kind of thing that is easy to set to the side on a busy day. So I recommend really that you set deadlines and follow them. And that was kind of the logic of doing these 5 webinars, was that theoretically everyone would do a little bit each week, and by this point be ready to do their writing. There we go. So a few plan basics to think about. First of all, you need to have several copies offsite. It's great and you want to have lots of copies in the building as well. But if you can't get to your building and all of your copies of your plan are in the building, you might as well not have a plan. So you need copies offsite. You may want to store things in ring binders because that makes it relatively easy to update. Or you may decide to go with another format. Ring binders are the classic emergency plan format. They're usually red because emergencies are red. But if you want it in some other format, like you want it just in like a stapled packet of papers, you can totally do that. My recommendation is always for paper. And you may want to have digital copies out there, but if you have some kind of an emergency and your power is out, if your plan is only in a digital format, as soon as the battery runs out on your device, your plan is no longer functioning. So paper, 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 paper wins. My recommendation on storing plans offsite is that everyone on the disaster team keep a copy in the trunk of their car with a personal crate of disaster supplies. And we'll talk about what might be in those shortly. But that way, people are usually with their cars or close to their cars. They usually would need their car to drive to the emergency to get there. So if your plan is in your car with your creative disaster supplies, it's always available. And then that makes it pretty easy to update the paper plans. And I'm going to tell you straight up, when if you have a 50-page document, you're not going to reprint a 50-page document every 6 months, most likely. You're going to just print pages that need to be updated. And as much as it would be lovely to just hand people the pages and say, hey, take these out of your plan and take your old pages out and put the new pages in. If you do that, what's going to happen is people are going to have really good intentions, but they are not going to actually manage to make that happen. They'll get distracted, and the first thing you know, the pages for the plan are at the bottom of a stack of papers on their desk. So what you have to do is pick a nice day and physically walk with people to their cars and to their offices and watch them replace the pages in their plan and take back the old pages. And that's the only way you can guarantee that your plans are all updated. And yes, it's kind of like kindergarten, but also it's the only way that works. And ideally, you'll update your plan at least annually. Every 6 months is better, but at least annually and after every disaster. So key contacts, that should be really easy because you have already identified all of your key contacts, hopefully. So that's just putting them in a list that's organized and remembering to add a phone tree for reaching your staff. So, yay, first section done. You may want a communication plan that details a sequence of calls once an emergency is noted. So if you are the archives assistant who walks in to retrieve a box and notices a leak, what is the sequence of calls that happens there? They call their supervisor calls the emergency team springs into action. If you're the security guard and you're there on a Saturday afternoon when the building is closed and you notice that something has happened, what is your sequence of calls there? You notice there's a leak in the reading room that's affecting collections. What calls does that security guard make? So you might want to create that kind of a plan. Also, you probably want a plan for communicating with the public, because if your emergency is big enough that your operations are affected, you need to make sure that the public knows not to show up or excuse me, what kind of help you need. So plan for communicating with the public. If that's social media, if that's updating your website, if that's updating your answering machine message, if that's putting out press releases, whatever that is, you might also include that in your emergency plan. And those should be something that is right up front and center, maybe even the first thing in your plan for that communications plan, so people don't have to look to find it. They just open the plan, boom, there it is. At this point, you've done all your risk assessments, so you've probably also completed your facilities information, and you have taken a set of procedures from somebody else and updated them so that they work for your institution. And hopefully you have also pounded out your salvage priorities. So all of that should be fairly self-explanatory, easy to do. You are getting really close to having this written. And then the last things, there's several of them that you need. You want a list of your emergency supplies and their locations so that you know what you have and where it is, so it's easy to find, it's easy to inventory. You want a copy of your insurance policy and instructions for how to initiate a claim. That may not be something that everybody needs to have in their plan, but it should definitely be in several plans that live with high-ranking members of the administration and the emergency team. Likewise, a copy of your emergency recovery company contract and instructions for how to initiate that. Although from what I understand with talking to emergency recovery companies, like the ones we talked about last week, they will probably know that you need them before you make the call. And if it's a major disaster in your area, they will show up. You probably won't even need to call them because they will just be there like magic. But if it's not a major disaster, it's something that is just in your building but you need help with, you may need to call them. So include that information. A list of where your financial records are so that they can be salvaged. A copy of your 501c3 letter if you're a 501c3 organization. That's important because 501(c)(3)s sometimes get price breaks on things. And I believe also if you're a 501c3, you don't have to pay sales tax. So that's useful. I would include a copy of your ICS structure if you have created one, so that everyone understands who is in charge of what. A copy of your emergency history and a list of locations of the plan, which is really important for making sure that your plan gets updated. If you don't know where all the plans are and don't check them off, chances are you're going to miss 1 or 2 or 3. So then your plan is written and assembled and you just have to finalize it. So the first thing you want to do is proofread it carefully. I might even go through all my phone numbers that I might need to call and call them up dial them from my emergency plan so that I know that the phone numbers don't have any typos in them. Circulate it to people who will be using it and ask them for feedback from staff members, your fire department, any stakeholders that you want to involve. And finally, when it is as done as you can have it done, you want to have your administrative authority, whoever that is, the director of your building, the president of your institution, dean of your libraries, whoever that is, get the final seal of approval that it is correct. And then, yay, congratulations, your plan is finished, except that it's never really finished. You have now completed writing it, but it is a living document that does need to grow and change with your institution and your institution's needs. So just because you have finished it once doesn't mean that it's done. And if you let that document sit and don't do anything to it for 10 years, it will be a lot harder to use. It'll be much less useful. It'll be a lot harder to update the next time you do it. So congratulations, your plan is finished. Now you get to maintain the plan. But maintaining is easier than writing if you do the maintenance. So, so much work. Good job, y'all. Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about supplies, because one of the things you're going to put in your plan is a list of supplies. And it's a good idea to take a look at all of the supplies that you might need in a collections emergency to see what you might want to buy. You should definitely stockpile supplies before you need them. You don't have to buy everything in the entire universe, but there are some basics that you should have so that you don't have to be sending somebody to the hardware store for paper towels and plastic sheeting. You just have it and you can get it in place right away. The other thing to know is that, well, you don't want your supplies to become depleted. You always want to have what you think you have in inventory, but they tend to disappear unless you monitor them closely. Because who doesn't want duct tape and trash bags and flashlights and batteries, and there's just good stuff in with your disaster supplies. So it's a really good idea to make them kind of difficult to get to. Not so difficult to get to that it's hard to use them, but you want to make people think several times before they break the seal on that container. So my favorite strategy is to get a nice, clean, brand new plastic trash can and put all your supplies in the plastic trash can. And then when you put the lid on, wrap it tightly in several layers of plastic wrap. Right? So that'll be easy to get off, but you will have to think about it before you do it. And that way you will know at a glance if your supplies have been raided because your plastic wrap has been breached. And if you come in one morning and see that your plastic wrap somebody has gotten into your supply kit, you need to take an inventory and make sure you have everything. You know that you may have had a disaster that you need to find out about, or you know that somebody has gotten into your supplies and you need to have a little discussion with them. And especially if you're in a larger building, it's a really good idea to have several of these cans and keep them close to collections so they're available when you need them. So maybe you have stacks on 3 floors. You have 1 can on each floor in the storage area. If you know that there's somewhere that's perennially leaky, maybe you keep your supplies in a closet very as close to that leak as you can make them. So yeah, that's how I supply. That's how I like to see people store their supplies. And we're going to spend some time talking about lots of different kinds of supplies because so many things out there that you could buy. You may not need all of them, and I'm certainly not being inclusive. I'm choosing ones to talk about this morning that I like to talk about and that I think are really important. But if you look at a supply list, you will see more things on it than I'm talking about this morning. So, the first thing to talk about are what you need to take care of you. And that's why we have the flight attendant with her oxygen mask, because if you can't take care of yourself first, you aren't going to be able to do your best work, especially in a high stress situation. Make sure that you have what you need to do your job. So these are things I would think about keeping in that. Remember I said we would have a milk crate of emergency supplies in your car? These are what might go in there. First thing I have on the list is a clipboard with paper and floor plans. So you may not have an easy writing space, so a clipboard is really useful for that. And floor plans are a very quick way to note what kind of damage has happened where. As a side note, the other reason to carry a clipboard is that if you have a clipboard, people will think you know what you are doing. Even if you don't know what you're doing, if you have a clipboard, people will think you are cool and have the situation under control. So it's a really good disguise for a situation that can be really scary and upsetting. Also, pencils, 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 pencils. You never want pens when you're working around collection materials anyhow. But if you keep pens in your car trunk for several years, they may not work when you come back to them, but pencils will. I'm a big fan of mechanical pencils personally because you don't need a sharpener. So cheap mechanical pencils are my go-to, and I would keep a bunch in my milk crate. Gloves. Hopefully you have some nitrile and heavy rubber gloves in your corporate emergency supplies, but you also should have some of your own in your personal supplies. Nitrile for handling collections, heavy rubber for dealing with moving things, dealing with very wet objects. We need lots of hand protection. I think it's important to keep non-perishable snacks and maybe a little water in your trunk. Snacks are very important on a disaster. You may not be able to get regular meal breaks, so you want to have whatever kind of non-melty bars that you like, or whatever packs of nuts. Just make sure that you rotate them so that if they're getting close to expiration, you eat them. I am trained as a conservator, and therefore I like to have some small hand tools with me. I feel much better if I've got a bone folder and a micro spatula and maybe a break-off knife. I can do an awful lot with that. It's a security blanket, a flashlight and batteries, maybe a cell phone charger, little portable cell phone charging brick, so that you can extend the life of your device if you need to. All of those are things that I would want. Your mileage may vary. You can have whatever you want in there, but I want you to be able to have what you need to be safe. Oh, I don't think I talked about protective clothing and footwear. That would be rubber boots and maybe a Tyvek suit, but I'm thinking even like an apron or a smock. Even if I don't care if what I'm wearing gets dirty, an apron or a smock is great because it has pockets that I can put my cell phone and my granola bar and my bottle of water and my pencil into and have my hands free. So next up is basic protective gear. And we'll talk a little bit about more PPE soon. I feel like these days, a lot of people have thought about a lot of PPE who might have never even heard the term before. But for a disaster, the kind of PPE you're going to be looking for will be nitrile gloves, like you would use in your lab, like you use in your reading room, rubber gloves, like heavy living glove kind of dishwashing gloves, safety glasses, because on disaster sites, you may have a lot of particulate matter in the air, potentially disposable Tyvek clothing. It's hot and it doesn't breathe and it's not particularly cheap for something that's disposable, but it is really good protection. And my hint for you on that is if you don't have Tyvek clothing around and you end up needing some, talk to your local funeral home, because they will have Tyvek suits that they use for removing bodies that they may be able to hook you up with quickly. That would do the job. Disposable shower caps are great. So when you travel, if you're at a hotel and they have a disposable shower cap, grab that sucker and bring it home with you to keep mold and dust out of your hair. I'm going to talk quite a bit about respirators and N95 masks shortly, hard hats to protect your head, and then aprons and smocks. And Anne wants to know, don't those phone charging bricks need to be charged themselves? And yes, they do, but once you charge them, they stay charged for quite a while. So just check the charge every couple of months and make sure that it is still charged. So basic organization and management tools. Pencils, preferably mechanical, so you don't need to deal with a pencil sharpener. Clipboards with paper and floor plans, clipboards for everybody so everyone can look organized, but also so that you have somewhere to write notes because you may not have anywhere else to put your paper down to write on. Tape. It is very rare that you will hear a conservator say, yes, you need to have tape, but you should have lots of kinds of tape. Duct tape is really useful for fastening plastic sheeting, packing tape for packing boxes and making boxes. Scotch tape, just in general, is good to have around and cheap enough. Masking tape for putting up signs. You can have all the tape that you want in your disaster kit. And I will never say that you can't have that tape. In your repair kit for materials, no tape, but here, tape. Scissors for cutting all that tape, and also utility knives for cutting plastic sheeting. Stickers and tags. First of all, stickers and tags make your disaster much more fun. Right? Stickers are, as every third grader knows, stickers are fun. And you should do what you can to make your disaster more entertaining for you. But really, stickers are great for things like marking boxes. You can have somebody come through with green, yellow, and red stickers and put green on your first priority boxes to salvage and yellow on your second priority and red on your do not salvage, or whatever system makes sense to you. Name tags for volunteers. If you are having a big enough disaster that you're bringing in volunteers, you will not know everyone on your site, and you want to make sure that you know who is supposed to be there. So some kind of a name tag, and if somebody doesn't have a name tag, you know that they have lost their name tag or they're a problem and you need to have a discussion about it. The Salvage Wheel is a publication of the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. Probably a lot of you have seen it. It's pretty common, but it's a cardboard wheel that shows all the different steps you take in a disaster and salvage steps for a wide array of types of collection materials. And it's well done, it's easy to follow, and it's really fun because the wheel spins around and people like things that are tactile. You also want a camera. It can be a digital camera, it can be a disposable camera. It can be the phone, your camera phone, as long as your camera has batteries in it, your phone's battery is running. But you need to be able to take pictures, and any camera that you use should have a flash, because if you have no power and you have no flash, you're not going to be able to take any kind of really decent pictures. And when you have a disaster, you definitely want to take lots of pictures, because you'll be able to use those photos going to document your insurance company, to tell people why they need to give you money. And let me tell you, if you have a big disaster, you're going to have a conference talk that comes out of it, and you'll want paper for those conference talks. And finally, a first aid kit, because I don't know, I always want a disaster specific first aid kit, because how many times have you gone to your building first aid kit for a Band-Aid and found that there were like 3 expired packets of some weird ointment and a couple of giant gauze pads, and that's about it? In a disaster, you don't want to be in that situation. You want to have everything that you need. So a disaster's only first aid kit is a good idea. Now on to building stabilization. So that's things like plastic sheeting. Plastic sheeting to drape over shelves to keep them dry, to cover windows that have been blown out for some reason, to divert water away from a leak. Lots of reasons to use plastic sheeting. Oh, to keep people out of areas they shouldn't be in. Duct tape is the easiest thing to use to put your plastic sheeting up. Caution tape. Disaster sites are inherently dangerous and you want to give people as much warning as possible. So caution tape, and yeah, so caution tape to keep people out of places they shouldn't be in. Brooms, you may not want to have disaster specific brooms, but you definitely want to know where to get your hands on them. Plastic buckets and trash cans. You already have one trash can because that's where your supplies are stored, but buckets and trash cans obviously useful in cleanup. A shop vac. Again, you might not have a disaster specific shop vac, but they are useful to have around. They're not great for vacuuming out gigantic amounts of water, like several inches of water, but they are excellent for pulling out small amounts of water that are hanging around in corners. And if you have a mold outbreak and you're vacuuming mold off of things, you can use a shop vac and put some water with bleach or water with liquid Lysol in the tank, and that will kill the mold as it's vacuumed off. If you're going to vacuum mold off of things, don't just do it. Call me up and let me talk to you about it before you do anything dangerous. And finally, you might want some spill pillows, which are just super absorbent pads that you can put in front of leaks that will absorb lots and lots and lots of water. There are some that I think you can dry out and use again. Most of them are just one use. Kind of think like disposable diapers, that kind of absorbency. And then basic salvage supplies, paper towels, and they need to be either white or brown paper. My very favorite are the fan fold paper towels that you can get in institutional bathrooms because you don't have to tear them apart. You don't want something with a print on it because those prints can run and bleed sometimes and transfer dye. So avoid those. But white paper towels, craft paper towels, both great. We use freezer paper particularly for wrapping books if we're going to freeze them. So if you have a large book collection, freezer paper is useful to have around. And freezer paper is just kind of plain white on one side paper with a plasticky coating on the inside. So when you wrap up your book, you put the plastic coating to the inside and the paper is less likely to stick. Plastic trash bags, obviously for throwing things away, but also for lining boxes if you're putting wet things into cardboard boxes. Nylon fishing line and clothespins are really useful when you don't have a lot of space because you can run nylon fishing line and hang photos and paper from the fishing line. And that way you don't need that kind of table space for them. Plastic milk crates are fantastic for packing out in after a disaster. You may not want to have 1,000 plastic milk crates on hand, but you might also think about where you could source them. Is there a dairy that would loan you some for the short term, or HEB or your grocery store chain? And I also, especially for archives, like Mylar sheets, like a 9x12 sheet of Mylar, because if you have stacks of paper that are stuck together, you can use the Mylar sheets to separate them. You just sort of drop the Mylar sheet on top, and the top sheet, the surface tension between the top sheet and the Mylar will be greater than the surface tension between the two pieces of paper, and you can gently lift that paper away. So I believe that I put this list in your packet for this week, but if not, I will get it to you. This is from the Field Guide to Emergency Response. It's their disaster supply shopping list with all the things that you might decide that you need, right? Like, so you see that they have door wedges. I don't have those on my list. Canned air, I don't have it on my list. But so it's a really comprehensive list and worth having a look at. Obviously, you have to, obviously these are things that cost money, which can be a challenge. So some supply strategies. First of all, your local big box stores like your Lowe's or your Target or your Walmart or wherever you shop and is active in your community, they have community funds that they can use for donations, and they can do in-kind donations. Like everything you need, you're going to be able to buy at your local hardware store. So see if they will donate some of that to you. Don't be afraid to approach them. The worst thing that's going to happen is they say no, but you might be able to get several $100s worth of supplies out of them. You also can think about going with several neighboring institutions and creating a supply cooperative. Like, for example, in New Orleans, they have a strong emergency response mutual aid group. And once you have signed onto the mutual aid agreement, you get keys to a closet that it's like an exterior closet. Everyone has a key to it, and you can go in and they have the shop vac. They have a surplus of paper towels. They have a lot of disaster supplies. You can go borrow them and then return them after your disaster, so you don't have to have as much of an initial outlay. I wouldn't do it just on trust. I would actually make people sign some kind of a mutual aid agreement before I did that. But you can also just go in together to get quantity discounts, which can make a huge difference. And then again, you don't want any of your supplies to expire or go missing. So when you update your plan is a really good time to also inventory your supplies. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about personal protective equipment, since you'll probably want to include some in your supply purchases and in your preparation. So when you buy PPE, you're going to choose the PPE you need to match your hazard. So not every hazard needs every type of PPE, but the common types include respirators, gloves, safety goggles, ear protection, and protective clothing like Tyvek suits and lab coats. And I really wanted to talk a lot about respirators because they are important. An air purifying respirator, and we're hearing a lot about masks and N95s and respirators in the news these days. So I'm going to tell you about them from a disaster's perspective. So an air purifying respirator is a respirator with an air purifying filter, cartridge, or canister that removes specific air contaminants by passing the ambient air through the air purifying element. And that's the OSHA definition. It means that you are breathing through some kind of a filter. And if you look at the canisters in my respirator, for example, it's like creased, heavy paper. It looks and feels just like an air filter for your air conditioning system. You want to wear a respirator anytime there is an inhale hazard. So common ones in cultural heritage would include when you have mold, if you are using some kind of solvent and it has vapors. Oh, that deteriorating cellulose acetate film that you have that reeks of vinegar when you open the file cabinet drawer it's in. Yeah, we don't want you breathing that in. Asbestos, lead, arsenic, arsenic in collections. It's more commonly found in museum collections than archival collections. But if you have taxidermy, if you have organic material that was collected in the 19th century, there's a good chance it was treated with some kind of nasty pesticides. And you want to be careful around those because they're still poisonous. Types of respirators you can use. There are half mask respirators. You see me in an incredibly glamour shot there, wearing my half mask elastomer respirator and my shower cap because I am dealing with mold. There are also disposable respirators, which are the N95 masks you've heard so much about lately. There are also full face respirators. Any respirator that you use should be approved by NIOSH, which is, I believe, the National Institute for Organizational Safety and Health. But they're the ones who say that it's a safe tool to use. And respirators come in multiple sizes and are made by many manufacturers. Probably what you're going to buy for your kits are disposable respirators, and they are appropriate when you have particulate contaminants. So that's like mold, dust, residues of pesticides. It's not appropriate for gases or vapors. They're not going to do anything to protect you from acetone fumes or vinegar fumes from your vinegar syndrome film. And it is professionally responsible for me to tell you that even if you are only using disposable respirators, you're not using the big old half mask elastomer one like I had on in the last picture. To make sure that you are using them properly and that they fit right, they do require annual fit testing. Fit testing is something that, oh, I've got a slide, so in 2 slides I'll tell you about fit testing. But they do require fit testing to make sure they are actually protecting you. So not everyone can wear a respirator. You have to pass a medical evaluation. Some things that can rule you out include being pregnant, having asthma, having a heart condition, having some allergies. All of those can rule you out. So you have to get a form signed by your doctor saying that you are healthy enough to wear a respirator. You also have to be clean shaven, especially for a half mask respirator. If you have a full face respirator that can fit snugly around your entire face, that's different, but most respirators are half mask. And if you have hair getting in the way of a tight seal, you're not getting the appropriate protection that you need. So sorry guys, if you want to wear a respirator, you have to lose your beard. You also need to be trained in how to use and care for respirators to use them safely, and you have to be fit tested. And I promised you fit testing information. It should be done annually. Most industrial medicine facilities can perform fit testing. That's probably the easiest way to get it done. You go in, their doctor signs off that you can do it. You sit through the training lecture, and then they put you in a respirator and put you in a hood and spray bitter stuff into that hood. And you tell them when you can see, when you can taste it, if you can't taste it, while you're performing a series of tasks. So they'll have you just breathe deeply, they'll have you nod your head up and down, shake it from side to side, recite a poem. And if you can get through all of those tasks without tasting the bitter stuff, you know that you're safe. They use bitter because it's really easy for the fit tester to see on your face when you've tasted something bitter, so you can't put one over on them and fib and say, no, I'm fine. You can also buy fit testing kits if you're going to be doing a lot of fit testing. But if you're going to do that, you want to read up on all the OSHA regulations about fit testing because it requires a certain amount of record keeping as well. So moving on from respirators, I'm talking about gloves. Nitrile gloves are preferred to latex because they're less likely to have allergic reactions. There's rubber in latex and people are allergic to rubber. They're also sturdier than latex and less prone to tears and ripping, which is important on a disaster site. You can use whatever color you want. Certain professions have colors associated with them, like the police use black, tattoo artists use black, medical industry usually uses blue. There's also purple. My dentist likes pink. Buy whatever color makes you happy. Museum standard doesn't really have a standard color that you need to think about. If you are dealing with chemicals, you want to check charts to make sure that the kind of glove you are using is safe to use with that chemical. You don't want to use a chemical that will dissolve your glove. And when you take them off, don't touch them. You kind of pull them over your hand inside out and wrap them up together into a little ball, never touching the outside of them, and throw them away. Yeah. Oh, so check for punctures, tears, etc. after you put them on. And if you are working with sharp objects, you can absolutely double glove. If you're going to double glove, it's a good idea to use 2 different colors so you can see easily if your top glove has been punctured. Remove them and replace them when they get damaged or when they're splashed with chemicals. Disposable gloves are disposable. They are not reusable. Take them off, throw them away. There are, I believe now, recycling programs for nitrile gloves. I believe that happens through 3M. And don't wear your contaminated gloves while you're touching things like your desk telephones, your elevator buttons, your doorknobs, etc., etc. I know everyone these days is getting really good at punching elevator buttons with their elbows. And finally, lab coats or Tyvek suits, especially when you're dealing with particulates, they're good to have. You can wash lab coats. Tyvek suits are disposable. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk about, now that you've done all this planning, you've got your supplies, everything, how are you going to get your staff up to speed on using the plan? So implementation. First, you need to distribute the plan to the right people. That's going to include potentially lots and lots of copies. Your administration should have copies. So maybe the dean of your program if you're at a university, or the director of your department if you're in a government facility, or their assistant might be a better person to keep track of it. Every member of the disaster team should have a copy. Every department should have a copy. You want to at least offer to share a copy with your fire departments and police departments. Some will want it, some will not, but definitely offer to give them a copy to keep on file. And then also, it's a good idea to have them in key locations of your building, like a reception desk, like the reading room, places where like the break room, places where there are people. On copies that are widely circulated or easily accessible, like those ones you have in the break room and the reception desk, you want to redact any confidential information. Nobody needs to have your archives director's home phone number if they don't necessarily need to have it, right? You don't need the random volunteer calling your archives director at 3 in the morning. And make sure that you know who has your copies. And that's important because when you update them, you need to make sure all of the plans get updated. You need to also train your staff to use your plan. So there are 3 real ways to do this. You should have a meeting, and I would advocate for an annual disaster plan meeting, but that may be hard to force people into. But at least when you have a plan for the first time, get people in the same room and let them talk about how to use the plan, tell them why it matters, tell them what's in it. There are also tabletop exercises which allow you to practice with your plan, and we'll talk about those shortly, and drills, a couple different kinds of drills you can think about doing. So this is just a quick staff meeting agenda that I drafted up. That's a way that you can get all of the information out about your emergency plan in an hour, or even half an hour if you don't do the little tabletop exercise I built in. So you welcome people, talk about why the plan is important and how you've made the plan, introduce the emergency team and talk about their functions. Talk about everything that's in the plan. How do you use it in an emergency, particularly for what components are going to be most useful for them. Talk about salvage supplies and where they are and what you have, and threaten them within an inch of their lives so that they don't use supplies unless they're having a legitimate emergency. Give them some time for questions and answers, and that's half an hour. If you have an hour, you can tack on a really quick half-hour tabletop exercise so people have a chance to practice. I love tabletop exercises. I love this picture. This is from the pandemic episode of Parks and Recreation where they do the world's most chaotic tabletop exercise. Yours is not going to be as chaotic as that, I hope, if you've seen that episode. But a tabletop exercise is just a scenario that includes discussion prompts and lets you imagine how you would react to a disaster and lets you practice using the plan. Everyone who is participating should have a copy of the plan so they can work through it. And generally, if you're doing this, it's a really good idea to have someone who isn't on your disaster team moderate the exercise. And that's because your disaster team members all need to be participating. And you also want to designate someone who isn't participating but is just taking notes so that they can scribble down reminders of what questions people had, where problems arose, and anything else of note that you want to talk about in a debrief session afterwards. I wrote this super generic tabletop exercise that really any kind of an institution can use. I tried to make it as generic as possible. But your prompt 1 is, it's 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and you're preparing to close for the night. You hear thunder. An alert comes across several people's cell phones that a severe storm is crossing the area, getting lightning, winds, downpours. You're getting 8 inches of rainfall before the storm ends. So what do you do now? And usually I read the prompt out loud, even though people can read it, because it's good to have people hear and read. And then you discuss the next steps. And when that kind of peters out, or when you run out of the time you've allotted, you move on to your next prompt, where you tell people that they are following the procedures outlined in the emergency plan for severe weather. And then you have a tree that gets struck by a bolt of lightning, crashing into your roof, leaving a large hole over collections where water is now streaming in. And your group has to decide how they're going to ensure the safety of staff, patrons, and collections. That sounds like a fun one to discuss to me. Give people a little time to work through that. And then make sure you add time to debrief. When you debrief, you're going to ask what worked well, what wasn't clear, how would you react differently if you couldn't reach the disaster team leader who would be in charge? What would you do if your power went out? You think about supplies and services. One way to think about tabletop exercises versus drills is tabletop exercises you use to test your plans and procedures. Your drills test your people. So, but I like the idea of doing a tabletop because it gives people a chance to work with the plan to make sure they see it in action. But drills are also super useful and important. And you should schedule your drills when your institution is occupied to get the most realistic experience. Yeah, it would be great to do a fire drill at 8 o'clock in the morning before any patrons were in your building, but that's not an accurate assessment of what your life is going to be like in a disaster. So schedule them when you're occupied. So you can do evacuation drills, you can do procedure drills, and what you've got going on in the photo that you see there is the funnest kind of drill, which is the wet salvage exercise. And in a wet salvage exercise, you gather a bunch of fake collection materials. Don't put anything that you care about in a tub of water, but get stuff that is similar to the kinds of items you might have. Throw them in a tub of water and let them soak for several hours, and let everyone in your staff practice salvaging them. Because if you've never touched wet paper, wet photographs, it's a very different experience than handling them dry. And it's good to get that experience before you're dealing with something that matters. So have a wet salvage exercise. They're so much fun. And then some final steps. You should schedule your updates. At least, final steps, scheduling your updates, continue risk assessment, supplies, salvage priorities, first responders. So when you schedule your updates, at least annually, you should definitely do them at least annually. Every 6 months is better, but that may be asking a lot of you. And also update them after every disaster event. You will learn things about your disaster plan every disaster that you have. So you want to update every event. When you are updating, the steps I would take, I would check my phone numbers, make sure all of them work, make sure my staff information is current, update my emergency history if necessary, document changes to procedures if necessary, and then, as I talked about earlier, distribute copies of everything to each plan holder personally and watch them update their copy so that you make sure that actually happens. Risk assessment is really a never-ending process. I recommend that you walk your facility interior and exterior from a risk assessment perspective at least monthly. And I know you're in your building and you're walking around it and you're everywhere all the time, but you're probably not looking at it critically. You're going through the building, gutting to where you're going, talking to whoever you're talking to. These walkthroughs, you should be very focused on if there have been any changes. And then about every 5 years, it's a good idea to complete your rep worksheets from scratch and really dig deep and see if there have been big changes. And then involve your first responders. And we talked about that the very first week, we talked about it, but things you can do now, make sure that they all have a copy of your plan. And when you update your plan, make sure they have updates. It's also a good time to hold a first responders appreciation event where you could have tours and refreshments and children's activities and just sort of strengthen those bonds, get them in to see what you have, talk about how you can help them as well as how they can help you. Make sure everyone is working together. And people will show up if there are refreshments. And here we are. Wow, my goodness. So, do you have any questions right now about anything we did this week? If you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the question box. And I'm going to wait for a minute or two and see if any show up. I feel like a lot of this week is pretty cut and dried. Like, these are supplies. These are what you buy. Let's see. Kate wants to know anecdotes from my experience. What kind of anecdotes do you want? Worst case scenarios, etc. That's a tough question. The worst case scenario for me is people who don't have a plan and find themselves completely surprised by anything. I also sometimes find that worst case scenarios end up being things that build up over time. Like, you don't have a plan, but then you're also not monitoring your temperature and relative humidity, and you don't go into that basement room very often, and then you do, and you find that you've got a terrible mold outbreak. It's kind of a tough question. I don't know that I have any great stories that go with today, but let me think about it and see if any come to me. I'm sorry that wasn't a great answer. Nicole wants to know vendor recommendations for supplies. So my first place would be shop wherever you can shop locally. If you have a local hardware store, that's where I would go. Some things you might need to buy from archival supply vendors like Gaylord or Hollinger Metal Edge or University Products. There are products called rest cubes, which is spelled RESCUBE. I want to say they're sold by University Products, but don't quote me on that because it may not be them. That gather together some common emergency supplies in a plastic box. Those are great because you get some common things that you need and there's not a lot of thought involved. But it's not the cheapest way to buy things. But really, I would look at, you decide who you like to shop with, whether it's Lowe's or Home Depot or Walmart or your local Ace Hardware or True Value Hardware. Those are where I would start buying most of my supplies. As far as safety supplies, I usually buy mine from Grainger, which is GRAINGER.com. And unfortunately, right now, there is a real shortage on N95 masks, as you all know, I am sure. So, and also on gloves, you may not have an easy time finding N95s or gloves right now, but hopefully, it can't be. The supply chain is going to have to work the kinks out. There's going to have to be more made eventually. So just know that when you can find them, you will need to buy them. I wouldn't advocate buying them now because there are more important people than you who need them. See, Becky says, if it's a small staff, should we involve the whole staff in the writing process instead of leaving it to one or two people? I would love to see that happen, actually. If you only have 5 or so people on your staff, let everyone do some of it. And that way everyone has ownership, everyone understands what's going on. I think that's a great strategy. And Rachel says, going back to respirators, do you need one anytime you're around film with vinegar syndrome? Or is it safe to be around these for small amounts of time without a respirator? So I feel like from a professional responsibility standpoint, I should say that anytime you are dealing with vinegar syndrome, you probably should be wearing a respirator. However, from my personal practice standpoint, which I'm not going to sue myself, so I don't want any of your employees suing you as part of why I'm telling you this. If I'm just like opening a drawer and taking a whiff and going, ew, vinegar syndrome, I probably am not going to put on a respirator just for that. And Donna wants to know if I can recommend a portable dehumidifier brand. I really can't. The things that I would look for are the largest possible reservoir, so you don't have to be emptying it every time you turn around. And excuse me, if it's possible that you can find one that you can get plumbed into your building so that you don't have to empty the drip pan at all, that would be ideal. But I don't have an actual brand that I particularly like over another model that I particularly like. That was a good bunch of questions. Thank you all. For next week, we are in the home stretch on this. So for next week, if you are following along and trying to get this written, my recommendations would be create a list of procedures and then assign procedures to people on your team to get them written. Create your supply lists. Make yourself a timeline for finishing this up and figure out how you're going to introduce the plan to your staff and get that in the pipeline. And one final thing, next week is our last meeting in this series of webinars, which is amazing because it has flown by, but it will have been, next week will be our 5th week. So there is time in the workshop to talk about how this went. If there is anything that we have not addressed yet that you would like addressed, please send me an email with those by noon on Monday so I have time to write and research. If not, I'll talk a little bit about stuff, and I'll spend the rest of the time of the class doing a very brief introduction to reentry and salvage. But if there are things that you have not seen addressed yet that you would like to talk about, please send me those questions by noon on Monday. And my email address, as always, is rebecca@elderpreservation.com. Feel free to reach out. I am delighted to help you and talk to you and let you know what I know. And that is it. That's what I have planned for the day.
Well, great. If there are no more questions, we can go ahead and wrap up.
Woohoo!
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca.
See you all next week. Thank you all for coming.
Bye. Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.